All right, we are live.
Okay, great. Thank you for joining us for the second generation panel, Being the Child of Holocaust Survivors. My name is Ellen Bachner Greenberg. I am the child of 2 Holocaust survivors and the president of Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, a group that is a partner organization for today, Holocaust Survivor Day. First of all, I want to thank Jonathan Ornstein for spearheading this wonderful idea, and for Colette Avatal, chairperson of the International Advisory Committee, and my fellow committee members for your commitment and hard work to making today the special day that it is. With me on the panel today to discuss our survivor parents and their legacies are Susan Kent Avgen, Leah Rozenfeld Sills, Mirriam Friedman Morris. While today's panelists will talk mostly about survivor strength and resilience, we know there are many who struggled. Today is about acknowledging, honoring, and celebrating all survivors. They are all heroes. It is important to do that today and every day. That 3 of the panelists lost a survivor parent within the last 12 months highlights the importance of showing survivors our gratitude now and every day going forward while they are still with us. May the memories of Roman Kent, father of Susan, Stefan Rosenfeld, father of Leah, and Ruth Bachner, my mother, be a blessing along with every survivor who has passed. A quick note before we begin. We will leave time at the end to answer questions. If you have any, please send them in the chat. And if anyone wants to contact us after the program, there's an email address that's posted, and also information about the Facebook group Descendants of Holocaust Survivors. So without further ado, the panelists will now introduce themselves. Leah?
Thank you, Ellen.
My pleasure.
And thank you so much for inviting me here to be present on this important event. And I'm going to start out just by sharing a very brief account of my father and grandparents' escape from Poland in 1940. And it's really a gift to be able to share all of it with you. My name is Leah Rozenfeld Sills. I live in New Rochelle, New York. My father, Stefan, an only child, was born in Łódź, Poland in 1934. My grandfather was a ribbon manufacturer, and he was away in Belgium on business on September 1st, 1939, when the war broke out, leaving my father and my grandmother stranded in Łódź. It was not until January of 1940 when my father and grandmother used transit visas to get from Łódź via train into Hamburg, Germany, and then into Belgium when they were finally reunited with my grandfather. In May of 1940, they had to flee again from Belgium. They went into Paris, then into Bordeaux, where they received transit visas again, this time into Lisbon. More luck, more timing, more documentation of immediacy and desperation. In July of 1940, my father and grandparents set sail on a Greek ship, landed in Hoboken, New Jersey, for any New Jerseyites out there, in July of 1940. My father was 6 years old when they arrived. Of the 233,000 Jews who inhabited Łódź at the beginning of the war, only 4% of them survived. That's about 9,300. My father and grandparents were 3 of them. They moved to New York. My father grew up in a successful household. He went to Stuyvesant High School, had a beautiful tenor voice. He sang opera, he sang jazz ballads, and somehow his stammer, which continued throughout his life, never got away in him telling some incredible puns or relating some type of encyclopedic detail. My father owned a film laboratory that dubbed and subtitled films. He met and married my mom, a beautiful Brooklynite, and had 4 children. They traveled, we all traveled. My parents threw some great parties, but also we had a lot of quiet family time. I am the youngest of my parents' 4 children. Now the middle-aged one. And currently I spend my time, my daily life working on various boards. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so Mirriam, if you could just give us a very brief description of where your parents were born and where they were during the war. Thank you, Mirriam.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel on this very great occasion. I'm the daughter of Auschwitz survivors David Friedman and Hildegard Tausig. My father was born in Ostrava, Czechia in 1893. My mother in Berlin, Germany in 1921. My father was a painter renowned for his portraits drawn from life and a leading press artist of the 1920s. His talent for portraiture played a central role in his career and saved his life during the Holocaust. He is best known today for his art series, Because They Were Jews.
Great. Thank you very much, Mirriam. Susan, now just tell us a little bit.
And I'm Susan Kent Avgen, and thank you. It's an honor to be here. Both my parents are Holocaust survivors. They were both coincidentally from Łódź, Poland, and both born in 1929. During the war, they both were in multiple concentration camps, initiated at Auschwitz. My father was liberated after a march from Flossenburg, and my mother from Bergen-Belsen, both in April of 1945. They, again, coincidentally, both came to the US as they had no place to go in Europe anymore. On the orphan transports, my mother was on the first boat, the Marine Flasher, and my father was on the second boat, the Marine Perch. They met 10 years later at a reunion in New York for the Gloucester-Hausen that the UNRWA organization had, that my mom was part of, near Heidelberg, Germany. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So as I said, I'm the child of 2 Holocaust survivors, Ruth and Fred Bachner. My father, who was born in Berlin, survived 6 concentration and labor camps, including Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and Dachau, and a death march. My mother was born in Austria, and her family fled to Belgium, where she was later hidden in a convent. Both of my parents immigrated separately in 1947 to the United States, and they met here in 1950. Okay, thank you, everyone. So let me start by asking you a question, Mirriam. The war ended, and every survivor, whether they were child survivors like Leah's father and my mother, or whether they were older, or like your father, who was 51 years old when he was liberated, everything they had before the war was gone, and they had to start over. How was your father able to do that? What was it like for him?
He had to overcome the crippling grief that he had for his loss of his wife and young daughter in order to build a new life. He had already returned to his art, but the war had taken a toll on him. In January 1946, he went to a town north of Prague to improve his health. There he met my mother, Hilda Tausig, and had his first Holocaust art exhibition in the town hall. Most of Hilda's family was murdered, and she was in a noticeable depression. My father wrote, "I noticed someone was needed who could free Hilda from the emotional pressure she felt as a result of the destitution and deprivation she suffered in the ghetto and concentration camps, in order to turn her into a magnificent person. Hilda and I were in the same situation. It soon became evident we were emotionally well suited to each other, which made us both happy, for we were able to help each other somehow and free ourselves from this pressure. In 1948, my parents married in Prague, and 1 year later, they escaped Stalinist Czechoslovakia for Israel, where I was born, and in 1954, immigrated to the United States, where my father embarked on a new career in commercial art to support his family. But he never forgot the pictures buried in his heart
Yeah.
from the concentration camp.
Yeah, and thank you, Mirriam. And yes, no doubt your father was quite the artist. I've seen a lot of his work, and he really is. So, Leah, let me ask you, what was it like for you growing up with a father who had survived the Holocaust? He had escaped, and he was young. But no doubt the Holocaust was with him. Was it a daily part of your childhood? What is in the background? What was it like for you?
It was not part of our daily conversations. We heard the story every year at Passover of his escape. We then knew every year we would hear the story of his insomnia, how he was able to wake up the entire group of people who were hiding in a hay cart while they were in transit from Łódź to Warsaw. And he woke them all up just as a German plane was flying overhead, and they all scattered into the field and hid. So we heard stories like that, but it was really quite a suburban life. Like I said, I was the youngest of four, and there was only 7 years from top to bottom. Very busy, a lot of people always coming in and out of the house. We never wondered why my grandparents didn't, why my father didn't have any relatives who had really come here with him, except for his parents and one uncle. My father loved music, so there was always music filled the air, and I think that came over with him from Poland. He was a huge Mahler and Beethoven, and once he came to the United States, on his first day when he arrived and went to school, the teacher in Queens, New York, told him to stand up. He's 6 years old, and said, "This is Stefan, the refugee boy." And from that day on, my father changed his name from Stefan to Stephen, and he really became quite Americanized. He learned English from listening to baseball. He became a big hockey fan. So it really was only during Passover when we heard part of his story.
Great. Thank you, Leah. And we'll hear later from Leah how later in her father's life that there was a shift. Okay. I'm going to talk about what it was like for me. So as a child, I was told about the Holocaust, and I knew the details of my mother's story as a hidden child in a convent, and about her parents who were hidden in a chateau as a maid and butler and maid. My father told me his story, and I distinctly remember having him sitting with him and watching a documentary on TV. It was black and white, raw footage of Auschwitz during the war. And it was very difficult for me to watch this. There were mounds of dead bodies and skeletal and emaciated faces looking out behind barbed wires. And it was just very painful for me to know, I was a child, that was my daddy, and I couldn't take it in. And it would be many years before I could really talk to my father about the Holocaust. And for me, that was sort of like a defining moment there. And my parents assimilated, and things were normal growing up. My parents were social and had many friends, and our home was full of a lot of singing, joy, and laughter. And I really feel blessed to have such loving and nurturing parents. There weren't other survivors in our community, and outwardly, my parents seemed no different than my friends' parents, who were all American born. Or so I thought, until I was asked why my parents had accents. And I didn't like being different. So my parents spoke openly, and as normal as things seemed, I have no doubt now that deep, dark memories were still locked up inside my parents. And, every now and then it would sort of rear its ugly head, those memories. And food and meal times were sensitive. My father insisted that we eat what was put on our plate, and it really didn't matter whether or not we wanted to or whether we liked it. My parents really never made me feel guilty that my life was easy compared to theirs, nor did they minimize my upsets. in comparison to what they went through, except for when it came to throwing out food. That really got to my father. And I remember him saying to me, do you know what I would have given for that food when I was in concentration camp? And fortunately, I didn't have to know. As my parents aged, especially my mother, it was clear that the impact of the Holocaust, not surprisingly, was still there, and it really had always been there. And at times it was harder for my mother to not react to the fears and worries that she had been able to keep in the background when she was younger. And for myself, although it didn't seem like the Holocaust played a really big part in my life, I now realize I was impacted by it in ways that I really hadn't known. And it's been a journey. Susan, what was it like for you growing up with two parents who were Holocaust survivors?
So even you talking brought up some new memories, but it was present, but it was also behind the scenes. Like you, Ellen, when someone called for the first time, they go, who is that strange person, with that accent? Oh, that's my parents. I didn't even hear their accents. It was just normal to me. But there were differences too, because like you mentioned too, we didn't have all these family members. We had a very small family. They didn't talk about the Holocaust in general. We spoke English at home. They only spoke Polish to tell secrets from my brother and I. They did have there was always a part of their lives. Some of their friendships were other survivors. They'd have their bridge games, etc. And then they had their American friends too. But it wasn't a in-your-face kind of talk about division. From an early age, they talked about, my brother and I were young, just about there was this bad man who did bad things. Okay, that was kind of how they first brought it up. We had my dad used to tell loving stories about his dog Lala, or the antics he and his brother used to pull on his sisters and to his mom. My mom didn't talk much about things. Really, the only thing she shared was that everyone thought her older sister and her mom were sisters. It really wasn't until I left for college at 17, that's when my dad started to get involved in different things, and there was more discussion and awareness of the Holocaust. Like you, I did come across once a picture, this is what you jogged my memory of a pile of dead bodies. And I remember how raw that felt, the emotion, and brought it up, but they really didn't want to talk about it at that point in time.
Right.
And I just always felt a little bit different than my American Jewish friends or my American friends who were not Jewish. There was just something there.
Right. It was unspoken. And,
Yeah.
you probably, I don't know about you, but I really didn't identify that it was there until many years later, until I read actually Helen Epstein's book in 1979. And, I could name it and recognized it. We all spoke that the Holocaust really wasn't talked about for many years. The Americans didn't want to hear about it. The survivors were told, oh, get over it, just move on. And then all of a sudden in the 1970s, there was a dramatic shift. And all of a sudden there were organizations that started forming, and Holocaust survivors got together. And I know, Susan, for your father, that was a really pivotal time, and he became very involved in organizations and spent the rest of his life doing that. So,
Yep. So as you said, there was a huge global shift, and I just read actually yesterday a transcript, and my father said he felt that it was when survivors had healed enough to be able to talk about what had happened to them, and that the world was ready to hear, listen, and accept responsibility for not doing anything during those times. He became very involved in many, many organizations, and I'm only going to highlight a few of maybe the most recent and some that have the most meaning to him. He was chairman of the American Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors, and he, along with Flatka and Ben Mead and Sam Block and a few other survivors, were the ones who created the first gathering in Washington, D.C. in 1983, where to their huge surprise and disbelief, 20,000 survivors attended. They also had something else that was close to his heart, is a teachers program, educating the teachers throughout the United States on how to teach about the Holocaust, because he feels that that is where it's important. This is how the torch gets passed too. He was on the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Council as the only survivor, president of the International Auschwitz Committee, the International Commission on Holocaust Era Insurance Claims, better known as ICHEC. And according to one of the members, Peter Lefkin, my dad was the moral conscience of the group. He was able to cut through the legal, political, or Jewish issues, remove any animosity, and be able to get work accomplished. He's president, or I should say, and bear with me, everyone, please, because my dad just passed away a month ago, so things are still a little raw. He was president of Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, to give back to those righteous Gentiles and their families who risked their lives, and also helps with their teacher training program too. And then the claims conference. He had multiple roles on the claims conference. His most recent role was co-chair with Stuart Eisenstadt on the negotiating committee with Germany. And just about 2 weeks before he passed, he was on a pre-meeting Zoom with the committee. And then I was told that the meeting happened a week after my dad passed away, but he was still there as a presence. They had a chair draped in black with his name and different tributes to him. And when negotiations got difficult, especially with regards to home care for survivors, something near and dear to my dad, they invoked his name, and it was helpful to get more money, again, thankfully.
Susan, I just want to say that Susan, I, and everyone else here really appreciates that your father passed away several weeks ago, and you're here. And when I think about it, is I paid a Shiva call, and I asked you at the Shiva call if you would be participate in this, which might be a little chutzpah, but I knew that I know you, and I certainly know of your father. My parents knew your father, and I knew that without skipping a beat, you said yes, and you would. So I appreciate that you are here. Your father spoke all around the world at all different forums, and he had many. Said a lot of meaningful things, and there are three quotes in particular that we'll focus on. And Ryan, in the background, if you wouldn't mind playing the tape of the first for Susan.
I'm going to let these be his words.
Because that's the key to my existence. We survivors do not want our past to be our children's future.
Powerful. We survivors do not want our past to be our children's future.
Now, something he said in his speech, and actually all three, I'm going to say two more after this, in the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And it still brings tears to my eyes, hearing him and seeing him say that. Two other things that he felt very strongly about and would repeat often is that hate is never right and love is never wrong. And the last of his three big statements was something he called that should be an 11th commandment. thou shalt not be a bystander. We should never stand by when we see injustice being done.
Yeah, thank you. You'll hear from all of us that our parents who were involved in Holocaust remembrance each did it in their own way, and different ways, but each equally as powerful. So in the 1970s, my parents also became involved in Holocaust survivor organizations. And when my father was in Auschwitz, he made a promise to himself and to God that if he survived, he would tell the world what happened. And once survivors no longer had to keep their story secret, my father started to make good on that promise. Both of my parents spoke at synagogues and to students for more than 30 years, and they made several testimonials. And in them, my father gives details of what it was like in the camps and talks about wanting to survive and his mindset, how he was able to do it. And Ryan will play now a little clip from my father's one of my father's testimonials.
And we managed to overcome, but it was an hour to hour situation. We lived through 1 hour, so he said, well, let me see if I'm going to live through that hour, and the moral was not bad, because I survived on hope. And I said, all right, I lived through this hour. Let me see how I'm making out the other hour. And that gave me hope to continue to do that.
I survived on hope. And my father took great pride that he had survived. And at the same time, he was humble. He knew that nothing he did could have saved him if he had not been lucky. And for that, he was extremely grateful. And even after the war, life wasn't always great. Sometimes it was hard. I believe that the fearlessness, determination, and strong will that helped him survive the Holocaust also helped him to enjoy life afterwards. And it's not that my father forgave and forgot the atrocities. It's more that he did not want to lead a life that was consumed by hate. That's not what he wanted his life to be about. And it took me many years to move from avoiding knowing my father's story as I had as a child to embracing it as I do now. And I've come to realize that my father's and my family's pain and suffering during the Holocaust is part of me, as is their strength and optimism. All of it is my legacy. And my father was proud to be a survivor, so much so that years before he passed away, he purchased a plaque to be put on his tombstone that would forever identify him as a survivor. And it's probably so that future generations who walk by his grave could pause for a moment and remember. And my father would always say, no one can take away from me what I saw with my own eyes. And maybe this is my father's way of continuing his commitment to letting the world know what he saw, even after he was gone. Now, Mirriam, your father saw a lot, and what he saw stayed with him. And he was able to use art to express what he saw. Tell us about his art and your father and what he did with what he saw.
The responsibility to bear witness weighed heavily on his conscience even before deportation to the Lodz ghetto. His burning desire was to show to the world the ruthless persecution and inhumanity as practiced by the Nazis, in the hope that such barbarism would never happen again. Obsessed by the tragedies he experienced, my father vowed, if he lived, to paint the scenes he witnessed in the ghetto and concentration camps. And so he did. After his retirement in 1962, he returned to producing the unforgettable scenes etched in his memory, from deportation to liberation. He wanted everyone to take a good look at his work and see what persecution under the Nazi regime was like. My mother was always by his side, and she spoke to groups and organizations, and later she showed my father's work.
Great. And this is your father painting himself in the portrait?
Right. My father would often place himself in his art to show that he was not just a witness, but also a victim. And this is his final piece, Liberation. Susan mentioned the American Gathering of Holocaust survivors, and this is what there was an exhibition of his work there, my mother and I held in my father's memory, and this is one of the pieces that was in the display.
Oh, thank you. Very, very, very powerful. Leah, for many years, your father did not know the entire story. He knew he was born over there and he had come here somehow to the States with his parents, but he did not know the details. Tell us about what changed, what happened that your father discovered that, and what was it like for you and your father and your family?
Well, 2014, my father is sitting in the kitchen and he gets a phone call. And on the other line is a man named Sylvan Bromberger who said to him, "Is this Stefan?" And my father said, "Who?" And he almost hung up on him. And the man said, Stefan Rosenfeld. And my father said, "I haven't been called Stefan in 75 years. Who is this?" And the man explained that he was calling from an organization called the Sousa Mendes Foundation. And he asked my father whether or not he had his parents' passports, their Polish passports. So my father ran down to the basement, found his parents' passports, and lo and behold, on the visa page is a signature of Aristides de Sousa Mendes. The Portuguese pronounce his name Mensch, which is very appropriate. So Sousa Mendes, and my father said, "Yes, there's Sousa Mendes. Name is stamped in the passport." And the man went on to explain the story of Sousa Mendes, the Catholic Portuguese diplomat who was stationed in Bordeaux, France, in May of 1940. And he went on to tell my father that Sousa Mendes saw what was happening, how people were flooding into Bordeaux, trying to escape, trying to leave after the invasion. And Sousa Mendes retreated into his room, and he had this this moment of clarity where he says, "I would rather stand with God and against man than with man and against God." And he started stamping all of these visas. And when the Portuguese government found out what he was doing, he was remanded, he was punished severely, and he died a pauper and in disgrace in 1954. So when we learned about this heroic action of this Portuguese diplomat who saved not only my father and his grandparents, but thousands of others, it changes you. It changed my father. It changed me. My father went down into the basement, gave me hundreds of family documents, wartime documents, correspondences from Shanghai, from Cuba, from in 3 languages. Everything was mixed in together. And I'm a librarian, and maybe that's why my dad gave me everything. But I started going through all the papers, and that's when we discovered. So not only the Sousa Mendes side, but we have an uncle who was rescued by Sugihara in Lithuania, and we started to find, through our connection to Sousa Mendes and then to the organization, the foundation, other visa recipients, and they became instant family. And my father really started to delve into his story, and we retraced his footsteps. We got to go on a trip with the other visa recipients and the family members of Sousa Mendes. Oh, there he is with one of the grandsons, Sebastian Mendes. And it was an incredible experience for him he never realized just the danger and that his parents were in every step of the way, and the luck and the timing and the blessings that they got along the way by righteous diplomats, and by people who helped them. The stress of the travel, I believe, was one of the things that did stay with him, of that escape, through his stammering. But when he got up on stage, like I said, he would stop stammering, and it was really a beautiful thing. And on this trip, my father really blossomed. He had such a kinship both with the family members and with these other visa recipients, that towards the end, when we went from Bordeaux into Spain and then ended in Lisbon, my father gave his testimonial at a synagogue, and it was there that he said, "I would like for all of you now to call me Stefan." So we started calling him Stefan. Yeah.
So as you see, we all have stories, and Holocaust, there's no escaping it. We're all part of it. It's in us. I'm going to ask myself a question that I always ask other second generations. And the question is, what would you ask your parent if you could? And I struggle with that because there are a lot of things I want to know, and I want to ask my father. I have tapes and tapes of my father talking about how he survived, and I want to ask him, you were a teenager. How did you possibly know that putting yourself through what you had to, that life would be worth it? How does a 17-year-old know, or have the mindset to continue to walk for 18 days on a death march in January 1945, wearing thin pajamas and barely shoes in the coldest winter in Europe of the entire century? How do you keep going? And, I suppose if I asked my father that, I don't know if I would get any more from him other than what he answered, what we heard him say in the tape, that he survived on hope. I think because for somebody like me, it's inconceivable how anyone could want to and do that. But for him, that might have just been part of who he was. And I'd want to also ask him, how were you able to, when he first came to the States, he didn't speak the language. He'd wanted to go to medical school. That wasn't happening. And it was an adjustment, but he was never one to sit down and let life take over him. It's amazing that my father or any survivor was able to get up in the morning and even put one foot in front of the other and move forward. So those are the questions. But what I wish I could tell him, and I would like him to know, is that the Holocaust and my father's story that I feared for so many years, I have now embraced, and it's part of me, and I honor it, and I'm proud of it, and I hope to continue doing the work that my father wanted to continue doing. So let me ask Mirriam. Your father was strong. All our fathers were, all our parents were. What's his legacy? What did he leave with you besides all that artwork?
I would like to go back to my childhood. I watched him paint with such intensity that it struck a chord in me. I saw that he had tremendous passion for life. I was intrigued about his mysterious pre-war life and the unknown fate of his Holocaust Nazi looted art. He was such a prolific painter, thousands of paintings that he did post-war, not just Holocaust artwork, from landscapes to abstracts to still life, beautiful scenery of our lives, from Israel to the United States. And I have to say that the will and drive that I saw in him carried over into my life. He always had to start over again, but had managed to transform tragedy into a beautiful, creative, and meaningful life. My parents' stories of survival reveal what it meant to be a Jew under Nazi rule. I inherited an art legacy. Diaries and testimony from both parents. But the artwork, of course, has its own responsibility. And I would like to have been able to tell my father that I succeeded to continue with his work, to show his art to the world. I am proud of my father's legacy, which continues to teach the lessons of the Holocaust. My father painted so the world would not forget. I work to exhibit and preserve his legacy as an educational tool for today's and future generations. And I continue to search for his lost and Nazi looted art. His artwork and testimony capture the lifetime of an artist, confirmation of a brilliant career the Nazis could not destroy.
Oh, thank you. Now let me turn first to Leah. Any final thoughts you want to share with us today?
Oh, thank you, Ellen. Yeah, I guess the up until 2014, when we learned the Sousa Mendes part of the story, I really didn't use my maiden name in everyday life, and it wasn't until I opened up that trove of documents and learned the Sousa Mendes story that I became just increasingly aware of how lucky I am to be here. And so I've added Rozenfeld to my middle name, because Rosenfeld to me now means, tenacious, fun-loving, and also just blessed to be here. And like you said, I try to just to say all of those names, the Sousa Mendes, the Sugihara, my grandparents' names. I say them out loud. I say them whenever I can. I stopped working as a librarian, and I do the board work now, and I advocate for children and tell the story, like I just said, to anyone and to whoever will listen. And I guess my hope to everyone out there is to tell your family's story. It's important. And my father and my family are in here, and every time I see a beautiful sunset, I know that they're with me. And thank you for letting me just give everyone just a glimpse of my father's beautiful life, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, and everyone here, you can see that all of our parents' lives were so rich and full, and this is just a glimpse, but we really appreciate you listening to us today. Susan, I'll ask you the same thing. Anything you want to talk about your father's legacy, your mother's legacy, or any final thoughts?
So some of the things that I've thought about have been my father's desire for moral justice. That was first and foremost important to him. And that came to true fruition when he got in front of the Bundestag, the German parliament, in the early 2000s, and basically demanded that they take ownership and responsibility for the government's role in the Holocaust, which they did. Continuity comes to mind for me in family. I think for survivors, and if any of you, have children, your children are their legacy. in part because the Germans didn't succeed in killing the Jewish race through our own, the 3G and us. I wanted to share two things that might not be known. One is that this day as an International Holocaust Survivor Day is a wonderful event to start. But just so people don't think that Holocaust survivors haven't been honored and thought about and praised, there have been international nights for many, many years that started in Israel and Germany and New York and continue on in many countries. Often it's during Hanukkah, which is the lightness over darkness, good over evil. In a holiday, the survivors are lonely, they can be together with community. There's a group that I lovingly call the Four Musketeers. They were three childhood friends of my father's that 30 years after the war, they discovered that they all survived. All of them became outspoken advocates for Holocaust survivors. Henry Rozenfeld, who settled and finally ended up in Austria, Nonek Flug, who ended up in Israel, and my father are no longer with us. And the remaining musketeer is Mirriam in Warsaw. And as a 2G, the things that come to my mind are responsibility to continue the work of our fathers and other survivors, helping those that are in need, and not letting time and words diminish and change the facts and uniqueness of the Holocaust. I'm impelled to be involved in groups, whether it be Jewish, non-Jewish Holocaust, non-Holocaust related, to help others. When I think of survivors, I think of them as role models. No matter what I'm confronted with, no matter how bad things may seem in my life, it does not compare to the living hell that our parents went through and other survivors went through. And if they could thrive and find a way to joy and happiness, I know that there's a path forward that comes from personal choice and action despite the circumstances. My mom was the silent partner in all this, but I'll say she was the glue that kept the family together, the tremendous team between her and my dad. A love story at the end that may not have started as a love story. I've only just found that out, but that's what it became, a tremendous devotion. And she and my father both taught me the importance of family. And lastly, there's no way to fill my dad's shoes, nor do I think he would want me to. Instead, he would want me to do what I can and what he and my mom taught me, to be a good human being, like his tattoosh, his father had taught him, to care and look out for others in need, to persevere, and to speak up against injustice, and in his words, to never, ever be a bystander.
Thank you. Really beautiful. So I'm going to, we have a few minutes for some questions, and great questions. I'm going to combine a couple of them together. And let's see. All right. Question about intergenerational trauma. Do you feel that you carry some of the trauma? Does it impact you? And if so, how do you deal with it? And I'll start off with answering that, and anyone can join in. The first time I spoke at a synagogue and told my father's story, a congregant asked the question, do you think you were impacted by your parents' story? And I said, your parents' experience as a Holocaust survivor. And I said, yeah, just like every child is impacted by their parents' experience, whether they were ill, whatever it was, the child is impacted. So yes, we are all impacted by our parents' story. they just have a most unusual and horrific story. What I've learned to do, this is what the question asks, is I've learned to also look at the bright side. Yes, there was a lot of horror and heartache, but to look at the bright side and the message of resilience, and to have a choice that if Holocaust survivors could look at the bright side, and you may not always have a choice what happens to you in your life, but we do have a choice to at least try and control how we deal with it, how we choose to react to it. And I think that's a very, very powerful lesson, message. And I also think that for myself, talking with other children of survivors, as I have in the past 5-6 years, has really been very cathartic and a source of strength and understanding. I encourage those of you out there to seek out other children of survivors, to form groups. I mean, I happen to run groups, and I'm blessed to have all of you now on the panel as friends. And when we talk to one another, we don't have to explain. We understand what it was like. We get it. And knowing that somebody gets it and hearing their point of view, what they add to it, really helps a lot in healing. Last thing I can say is that what we went through and the intergenerational impact was when we were younger, and we didn't understand what was going on. Of course we didn't understand. Nobody could possibly have. But I think it's very healthy and healing to look at it now, to look at our parents and their lives and the impact that it had on us, with the maturity and the years of experience that we have now. And you're looking at it through a different lens. Oftentimes we can come to new understandings and see it differently. Like, for example, Mirriam, did you always, now you talk about your father's strength, and you too, Susan and Leah, was it always that way for you, or have you developed and shifted into being able to see the intergenerational impact as strength? What was it like?
For me, my father never discussed the Holocaust with me, but I could see it in his painting and in his drawings. And I watched him actually produce the second series, where he would hold his mirror and he would draw himself into the work. And I think that somehow I disassociated myself with the Holocaust. Although I understood the general, how can you really fathom what you were seeing as a child? But as I grew up and into my teenage years, I absolutely got it. And my friends would come over and we would sit and look at my father's artwork. And we were just totally spellbound by what we saw. But did we understand it? No, nobody could understand it. As far as strength, my father, he continued to paint other media. He always went back to his Holocaust artwork, but he also had to space himself and do other work. He would like to go out in nature, he would paint trees, and then he would go back and do his other work. But I think that overall, my parents lived a very positive and optimistic life. They had friends, they socialized. My mother loved life. She enjoyed going out. She enjoyed shopping, so it was like everything else.
I think that what I'm hearing is that just like our parents, Lord knows how, we're able to focus on the positives. When we look back at the trauma or the intergenerational impact that had on us, maybe it's healing to try and look at it with the understanding of the strength rather than only the weaknesses.
So I think that we in this panel were very lucky, because we had parents that had those characteristics and were able to, what I'm going to call, make that transitional shift, to be able to compartmentalize that aspect of things. What I have seen in where I've lived in different parts of the country in my life, and being part of a 2G group once when I was living in Colorado, I met someone who didn't have that same kind of upbringing, whose parents were still in some way stuck back in the old days in the shtetl, and didn't have that transitional force that I will say, we're lucky enough to have those circumstances. And I think for individuals like that who had a different childhood, okay, they might have different feelings about things. And it would be, like you said, Ellen, not until maybe coming into adulthood and being able to tweak out some of these differentiating factors. Can you maybe try to find, maybe you have to find your own internal shift in the same way that our parents did in order to survive.
Right.
I'd like to just add that I think the greatest joy to our parents was having us children. I think that that is the greatest legacy. Having children and being able to carry on life brought joy and peace. And when I look at our pictures, our family pictures, there's always that peaceful look. My father looks a little off in the distance, but I really feel that we were such a close unit. We enjoyed going out. I felt that I had a normal childhood. I went to dancing school. I played the piano. I joined the Brownie Girl Scouts. So it was like, my life wasn't all that different than all my friends who were not children of Holocaust survivors.
But there were a lot of children of survivors, as Susan said, who weren't as blessed as we were. Exactly. And you know, you're talking about a shift, and I'm thinking about one of the 2Gs. I won't mention her name, and she used to, you know, her mother said really bad things to her, and she really had very bad animosity towards her mother all these years. And I've noticed a shift. Now she's talking about, she's making a picture book of her mother, and she's talking more lovingly from speaking with other 2Gs and coming to these realizations. And somebody asked her, was your mother mean? And her answer was, she wasn't mean, but she said mean things. And to me, that was huge, that she was able to shift it. Instead of having that anger at her mother, she was able to understand it. And that's you know, certainly not an easy process. You know, it was very cathartic for her. And the time went very fast. I'm looking at the clock. And before we officially end, I just want to ask you if we have something really special that I found out about this morning. It's going to only be 3 minutes, that they've put together a video of about 3 minutes long of the Shehechianu, and which is really special. I always grew up, the first time you go to college, you say Shehechianu. It was always like a milestone. And today's a milestone. That is the first Holocaust survivor official day. And I'll end by thanking everyone for being here today, for thanking the panelists, for sharing your family and yourselves with us, and your intimate thoughts. And for Jonathan and everybody and the JCC for putting this together. So I'm going to sign off, but please stay for 3 minutes while we all watch together and be part of this wonderful Shehechianu.
The Shehechianu blessing is said whenever we do something for the first time in a season or in our lives. And because this is the first International Holocaust Survivors Day, I'd like to sing the Shehechianu for you now. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Shehechianu וכי עמנו והגיענו לזמן הזה שהחיינו וכי עמנו והגיענו לזמן הזה שהחיינו וכי עמנו והגיענו לזמן הזה שהחיינו וכי עמנו והגיענו לזמן הזה, לזמן הזה, לזמן
Amen.